What's new from Apple? There's the new iPhone 16 Pro, built for Apple Intelligence. And it comes with the all-new camera control, giving you an easier way to quickly access your camera tools. The new Apple Watch Series 10 has our biggest display and our thinnest design ever. And this? It's the sound of active noise cancellation, now available on one of 2 new AirPods 4 models. So quiet. Check out all of the new products and new features at apple.com. You can even buy yourself something new. See apple.com for product availability updates. Apple Intelligence coming this fall.
Your teen requested a ride, but this time not from you. It's through their Uber teen account. You drive your teenager around, a lot, to their friend Jacob's house, their other friend Jake's house, to James's, to Jaden's, to Jalen's, to...
Mom? This is Jake's house, not Jacob's.
Now with an Uber teen account, your teen can request a ride under your supervision. They'll ride with a highly rated driver, and with live trip tracking, you'll follow along the whole ride to their friends' houses that all sound the same. Add your teen to your Uber account today. See app for details.
Bye, Mom.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, X, Threads, and Facebook at Red Treehouse Pod. And now you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community for as little as $3 per month and receive exclusive member benefits, including personal shoutouts, early access to episodes, bonus episodes, and more. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. As always, if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Important note, sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. He shows up when you least expect it, and he can show up just about anywhere. You might catch a glimpse of him while walking down the street. He may show up in your dreams while you sleep at night. And it's possible that when you open your eyes, he's there, standing in the shadows of your darkened bedroom. And no matter where or when you see him, the unease and fear will feel overwhelming. Because for a while, you likely won't be able to make out who he is. But the closer you get, or should I say the closer he gets, the more visible he becomes. And as the shadows pull back their curtains, and as he moves closer and closer, you notice a peculiar but terrifying facial feature. A wide, sneering smile that seems to fill his face and goes from ear to ear. While your mind convinces you that you're screaming, you quickly realize the sound is stuck in your throat, and there's not really anything you can do to protect yourself as he inches closer and closer, his awful, smiling face filling your field of vision. In this episode of The Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the truly scary story of the Smiling Man. And rather than tell the story in my own words, I'm going to read it straight from the source. What would you do if while out on a walk late at night, you caught a glimpse of the terrifying Smiling Man? I'll tell the story. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. Our first story of the Smiling Man is the original post from Reddit user blue_title. Quote, about 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the U.S. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite. But all of that changed in just a few minutes on one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park quite away from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking, and he was headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky, and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still, until I could make out his face. His eyes were open wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back, and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing, and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing, to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved, until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time staring at him. And then he started moving toward me again. This time, he took giant, exaggerated tiptoed steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone. Except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point I ran away, or pulled out my pepper spray, or my cell phone, or anything at all. But I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen as the smiling man crept toward me. And then he stopped again, about a car length away from me, still smiling his smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to ask was, "What do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper. Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around, very slowly, and started dance walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go, until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way. And this time, he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see. End quote. Though this was first posted over 10 years ago, encounters with the smiling man persist to this day. Reddit user Zach from Broken Hill posted, quote, "Hi, my name is Zach, obviously. I thought I'd share an encounter with a guy who fits the description on this page. I don't know if my smiling man is the same as the one on here, as I've seen many people claiming there's supernatural elements at play, and none of that happened to me. Anyway, here I go. It started under a streetlight. I was doing my usual early morning walk around my neighborhood with my dog Charlie. I left my home, locked my door, and started my walk. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except for a feeling. For some reason I can't explain it, at least not yet. But I had a chilling feeling, and the hairs on the back of my neck refused to sit down. Charlie kept closer to me than usual the whole time we walked, his ears perked up and alert. That's when I saw him. Under a streetlight, a man in a long trench coat, his collar concealing his face under a fedora. He stood tall. He must have been at least 7 feet tall. His hands were in his pockets. I was unsettled, because deep down I knew something was wrong. As I walked past, he said hello to me, his voice raspy. Out of instinct, I said hello back, and I think that was my mistake. Charlie was suspicious of the man, and didn't take his eye off him, and he was growling as we walked past. I picked up the pace, because I wanted to finish my walk and get home. We got further around the block, when I heard from behind me rhythmic tapping on the pavement. It got louder and louder, so I walked faster and faster. My walk takes me past my local police station, and there's always someone at the reception desk with a clear view outside the door, and this night was no different. I stopped out front and turned to face the rhythm. It was the man. He was dancing, following me by dancing. He stopped when I noticed him, but he wasn't looking at me. Instead, he was looking down slightly. Charlie took a combative stance, growling and snarling at the man. It was then that I noticed something. A smile, ear to ear, some white teeth, others yellow. It was unnatural. And it was at this moment the officer at the reception desk opened the door to ask why I was standing outside. I told him this man had followed me, and the officer ushered me inside. He rushed me and Charlie in, and I quickly found out why. The man had looked up and stared directly at me. That toothy, unnatural smile, still ear to ear. Before I got inside, he asked in that raspy voice, "No smile for me?" The officer locked the doors behind us and radioed into other police in the area. We turned around to the man standing at the door, who was staring us down from outside. Charlie barked viciously at it. I spent the night at the station, and in the morning I gave a statement. The police found nothing on the guy. His face matched no records in the system. A few days passed, and the story broke in the local newspaper. A few people came forward with similar stories. I'm back at home now, but I don't think he's gone. Some nights I hear tapping on my windows. Charlie is almost always on edge now. But most concerning is almost every night I hear that godforsaken tapping and the rhythm on the concrete outside. I think my saying hello was a mistake. End quote. Our second encounter with the smiling man is from Reddit user Slawboss. He posted, quote, "As the title states, I was watching a documentary on Prime about the Mothman when they started talking about a smiling man. While watching, I began to Google the smiling man. It led me to the infamous post about the guy in Seattle or wherever. It gave me chills. Not just because of the story, but because it sounds eerily like a story I've told about my parents my whole life. I'm 39 years old. The story takes place in a small college town in Tennessee with a population of about 6,000 in 1981. My parents were walking down the street from an old diner that served late at night. They said this happened sometime after midnight. They were walking home and noticed a very tall, lanky man in an old dusty suit. They've always said the suit was dirty. He leaned up against the light pole, smiling ear to ear. Creeped out. My dad, side note, they were 18 by the way, grabbed onto my mom and they nodded while he stared at them with a frightening smile. My mom said his teeth were all rotten and gross. And as they passed, they heard a shuffling sound behind them and a ticking sound. My mom said she looked back, and the man had a cane and was doing a funny walk, almost like a skip and a limp, she said, while he was ticking the cane on the sidewalk. She said he was like Pepe Le Pew from the old Looney Tunes cartoons and had the most devilish grin. They kept walking faster and faster, and he seemed to be going the same speed, but was somehow getting closer and closer. My parents crossed the street, and so did the limping, smiling man. The police station was 2 blocks away, so they decided they would just take off running there. The man just kept coming after them, with his limping and skipping walk. They arrived at the police station and told the police. Their house was just another 3 blocks away. The police went out looking for the man, and after 30 minutes to an hour, the cops came back empty-handed. My folks decided the weird smiling man was probably spooked and walked home. When they got to their street, the man stepped out of a shadow into the light in the middle of the street. My mom said she screamed, and they bolted back to the police station. The police went out looking again to no avail. The cops offered my parents a ride home, and they obliged. They went inside and locked all of the doors and never saw the man again. I have heard that creepy-ass story my whole life, as my dad and mom both would tell it. They both claimed it was the strangest thing to ever happen to them, and that it seemed supernatural. I have thought of that story every single time I've walked somewhere alone at night." End quote. Our third encounter with the smiling man is from Reddit user MJJZM2. Quote, "This story is true, if you believe it or not. The story starts last winter, when I was going to get food. I noticed this man was following me, so I turned around to confront him. I asked him if I could help him, and all he did was tilt his head and smile at me. Then he proceeded to walk away. I continued my walk home, but when I was about halfway there, I heard someone sprinting at me. I turned around, and I saw him running at me with nothing but a wide smile on his face. This was the day that his face was imprinted in my mind forever. I took off running home, closed the doors, and locked them. I ran to the window to look out, and I saw him across the street sitting there, looking at me and smiling wide. I called the police, but when they arrived, he was gone. Over the next few months, I noticed footprints around my yard, and every night there was a tapping on my window. And on a few nights, I saw him in my backyard, smiling and staring at me. When I would call the police, every single time when they arrived, he was gone. Then, on the 4th of July, I was home alone, and I heard the front door open. I looked downstairs to see him, staring and smiling at the ceiling. I closed the door of my upstairs bedroom. I locked it and called the police, but when they arrived, he was gone. It's been months since I've heard from him or seen him, but last night, I looked out my window, only to see him staring again." End quote. Our fourth and final encounter with the smiling man is from Reddit user Anonymy13. Quote, "I know most posts start with, 'I never believed in the supernatural before this.' But I feel the need to point out that I didn't either. I'm a huge skeptic. I guess I know I'm wrong about the supernatural now. I'm from the Midwest, like most everyone who posts about this guy. I'm not going to tell you exactly where because I've got a thing about giving away my details on the internet. This is a throwaway account, by the way. If anybody I knew in real life heard this story, they'd all think I'm insane. In fact, I'm starting to think I'm insane myself. Anyway, before I let myself get more off track, the second thing I'll say is that no, I'm not from Iowa, but I'm not far from it either. I was convinced this guy was a made-up story, like Slender Man, until a couple of nights ago. It's taken me that long to wrap my head around the fact that he's real. So I guess I should stop stalling and tell you my story. I have insomnia, and I hate being restless. The combination usually leads me to go for late-night walks, until I feel relaxed enough to at least go home and read, praying that I'll fall asleep. I think it was around 2:30 in the morning when I felt someone's presence behind me. At first I brushed it off. I mean, I'm out at nearly 3 in the morning. Who isn't going to feel a bit of paranoia? I think I walked a block and a half without the feeling going away before I decided to risk a peek over my shoulder. He was standing. No, sorry. He was dancing underneath the street lamp, about half a block behind me. He didn't seem to be aware of me. Seem being the key word here, considering I felt his presence for a couple of blocks. He was carrying on his strangely fluid dance with no one, his head cocked up to the sky, and that fucking grin on his face. It was inhuman. The smile felt wrong. I thought if he could smile anymore, it would tear the sides of his lips. He was around 6'4", wearing a shortish top hat and a suit, looking like it needed a good trip to the dry cleaners. I stared stupidly with my jaw hanging open, wondering if this was a particularly vivid sleep-deprived hallucination, when I tripped over a crack on the sidewalk and fell on my ass. I guess I'd been walking backwards, a subconscious attempt to get away from him. I remember letting out a yelp when I connected with the concrete, and that's when his head whipped down, inhuman smile and all, his eyes locked with mine. It was the single most terrifying moment of my life. There was nothing sane, nothing human, nothing remotely logical in those eyes. It was terror, insanity, and everything wrong with the world. The next thing I knew, I was sprinting down the street, wide awake right now. I've slept about an hour total since that night. Everything I remember from the stories I've read about him went flying out the window. I felt dread, terror, and an intense fear I didn't know was possible. I must have run a couple of blocks, attempting to loop back to my house before I risked another glance over my shoulder. When I did, he was right there. 20 feet behind me, maybe. He didn't look exerted in the least, still doing his dance run thing with those abnormally long legs. Meanwhile, I'm not sure if I'll be able to draw in my next breath or not, and I was only barely able to keep running. In a moment of sheer stupidity, I ran past my house, my fear too intense to stop. I'd rather not get caught by whatever this guy was. I don't know if my hands would have been able to stop shaking enough to get the key in the lock quick enough anyway. In another moment of stupidity, I turned sharply into a neighbor's driveway and sprinted into their backyard, ducking into the deepest part of it. My eyes were clenched shut. I had my arms wrapped around my knees, and I tried to basically stop breathing, even though I knew it wasn't going to do me any good. I heard rocks skidding along the driveway, and then they stopped. But I could feel his eyes on me again. It felt like an eternity before I was able to open mine. And there he was, standing not 7 feet in front of me, dancing, staring, and smiling. I'm never going to be able to burn that look out of my mind, no matter how many shots of whiskey I take. when I die, it'll probably be the last thing I think of. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to do anything, and I'd be able to get up and sprint out of the place without worrying about him coming after me. But then, he started dance walking closer and closer until he knelt in front of me. We were nearly nose to nose. Out of all the things I could have been thinking at that moment, the thing I was focused on was the fact that his breath was cold. Ice cold. I shudder thinking about it. We were posed like that, me with my arms wrapped tightly around my knees, and him just kneeling and breathing and smiling for what felt like an eternity. I was about to let out a scream that surely would have woken up the entire neighborhood, and I'm not too sure what good that would have done. But he stood up, immediately picking up his dance where he left off, and danced right down the fucking driveway and left. It took me 20 minutes before I was able to stand up and walk back to my house. I puked in the bushes out front before I managed to unlock the door. And like I said before, I still haven't slept. Every time I look out a window, I expect to see his face there, pressed up against the glass with his ear-to-ear grin. I don't go for walks anymore either. I've started working out when I can't sleep. And I'm not sure I'll ever leave my house again at dark. End quote. I'll admit, I truly love a good scary story, whether it's true or not. For me, the smiling man sits in the uncomfortable space where it could be true. Unlike some of the bizarre monster encounters which seem out of the realm of possibility, the idea that a strange man stalking or chasing you, and doing it with a terrifying grin on his face, is entirely plausible. Having grown up in New York City, I can almost picture myself walking down a dimly lit street, seeing someone in the distance, and running as fast as I could to make it home safely. I've always said, I'm not afraid of the dark, so long as I'm inside a building. But once I'm outside, all bets are off. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with these lingering questions. Have you ever encountered the smiling man? If so, email your story to redtreehousepod@gmail.com, and I'll feature your story on an upcoming episode. What would you do if you came face to face with the genuinely scary, smiling man? I've shared the details. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.